Could not have teed up the next questioner better, Mr. Khanna.
Well, thank you, Chairman Gallagher. Mr. Wolf, I share your sentiments with Morris Chang. We met him, Representative Auchincloss, Representative Gallagher, and I. And I didn't know actually until I met him that he was an American expat, educated at MIT and Stanford, had been here 25 years. Texas Instruments said, we don't want to do manufacturing. So he goes to Taiwan and they set up TSMC. We could have avoided the whole thing. I was struck by your comments as on long horizon science, as Mr. Mueller also talked, and you talk eloquently about the need for scientific research and funding. You wax eloquently about the need to cure cancer, celebrate it. I assume that means you're for increasing the NIH budget?
I am. It's interesting. This, to me, was a bipartisan issue. I was privileged when, in the early days of material science and nanotechnology, President Bush II had invited me into the Oval Office, signed in $1 billion a year. You had Newt Gingrich at the time, who was actually calling for a tripling of the NIH budget. And I would love to see that be a bipartisan issue, to see that science is not a waste of money. It's a critical investment in our future.
Just to, because I'm trying to persuade my colleagues, when we get the China committee here advocating against the reversal, you would not be for the $3.8 billion cuts that the Republican budget passed.
I think the more money we can spend on science, and I realize that budgets are a difficult thing of where you get the money from.
Just clear, we got a large budget. We can find a way to reverse that in the final passage. So your recommendation to the Congress would be, do not cut the NIH budget, correct?
I would not cut, however.
Okay,
I would,
I want to give
it's important. I would make sure that we really bias towards young scientists.
I'm for that. I'm making reform, but I just want to make sure that we have your official recommendation as a Republican witness that you want to increase the NIH budget, because we still have time in this process. And the Honorable Ivanina, you were very eloquent in the CHIPS Act, which I had something to do with. And you said the CHIPS and Science Act is an excellent start in reversing the chronic public underfunding of U.S. research and development. I wholeheartedly agree. It was a bipartisan effort. Representative Gallagher was involved in the Endless Frontiers, and Senator Young. I assume you would believe the CHIPS Act should be funded?
I do, Congressman. I think the CHIPS Act, if we do this right, 20 years from now, we'll look at the CHIPS and Science Act as the beginning of a lot of good bipartisan efforts to fund the private sector.
Would it surprise you, sir, to know that the CHIPS Act, which calls for $15 billion of funding at the NSF, and actually the budget that was passed, the Republican budget, actually cuts the NSF funding going backwards from last year?
I wasn't aware of that.
Would you oppose that cut?
Well, if that money went to facilitating security efforts in the CHIPS and Science Act, then
it just was a cut. The CHIPS Act says we got to get to $15 billion. We gave them about $9.8 billion last year. I would have thought we'd go higher. It's actually going lower. I'm not trying to score political points. I'm just trying to say we're going to have a lot of fights over the budget. I would hope that the NSF and NIH are two places we don't have the fight. And I'm hearing you in your written testimony say you think we should be increasing that funding, correct?
We should be, as well as increasing funding for security of what's coming out of the CHIPS and Science Act.
I would just say this, Mr. Chairman. I have so much respect for you, and of course for Vice Chair Representative Whitman and doing things together. I think more important than just the hearings is actually the funding. That's what Congress does. And I hope on a bipartisan basis we could recommend as a China committee to increase the NSF and NIH funding and take that out of the political theater we're going to have on the budget. I yield back.